Yes, sir. Well, unfortunately, I probably will also be prophetic today.
Don't stop. Don't give out nothing yet. Wait, let brother. Don't give out nothing. Don't do the interview yet. Wait a second. Okay, man. We live on YouTube. Go, brother Leroy.
And this is the Wisdom Table, April 15th, 2020. I'm Brother Leroy, co-hosting on the Wisdom Table. The program that you're about to hear does not reflect the views, attitudes, whims, deeds, or any other proclivities of the Resident Association of the Grant Houses in Harlem, USA. Neither do the insights and opinions reflect anything about the management of this night's development. However, the program does reflect the research done by the participants in the program live in living color in studio and by phone interview in the future. But we do have a chat room on YouTube, so you can use that freely. Our guest is a young man who has served us well going back quite some time. We thank Brother Wali for introducing him to us and us to him, because in the shows that we've done over the years, he has given us an insight into things that are going on right in front of us via the news media. But there's another view, and he's provided that insight that's public, but the average person is not aware, and the newscasters is definitely not giving that type of information up. We're talking about Dennis Speed, who we had on a few weeks ago. This is an analysis, political analysis, and it's not the usual medical or health analysis, not directly, but it does affect you and I. We're thankful to the Most High for blessing us with another day on this good earth, another day to do some good deeds, and that's what we have to do, put good out front, put God out front, and well, we leave it up to his will. Without further ado, Brother Dennis Speed, thank you for joining us on the Wisdom Table.
Very happy to be here, Brother Leroy.
Okay, a lot is going on in the media, little pieces of conflict in Washington peeks out, and then again it submerges. So you really, they are united when it comes to giving a so-called united front. So we need interpretation of what's going on that the average person is not seeing and understanding in media today regarding the coronavirus.
Well, that's there's a lot going on. Of course, there are some things that people are now aware of, but let's just be clear. As of right now, we're talking about a disease called COVID-19. All right, that's the disease. You'll notice people will hear sometimes something called SARS-CoV-2 or CoV-2. That's the name of the virus that they're talking about. And what we're being told is many different things, but let's just get to what the conclusions are if you follow it out. The conclusions of what we're being told is we don't know who is infected, partially because we are not testing enough people, and also because a lot of people are asymptomatic. You don't see the symptoms. We don't know exactly when you become contagious once you've got it, because you may not actually get sick. We're not clear entirely how contagious you are even after you get the symptoms. And we're now told, partially because of some results from South Korea and partially because of some results coming in from Italy, that it is not clear that if you recover, that you have enough antibodies to make you immune. In other words, you may be able to be reinfected and even reinfected right away. And further, we know that it is highly, highly contagious. And we know that if you've got cofactors or underlying conditions, as they call them, which virtually everybody Black in America has because they're Black, you basically can die of it because it may be a tipping point. So I just want to, first of all, just let people realize what you're being told. Now, if you look at that, that's about the worst news you could get. Oh, and also it's spread by aerosol, and it can spread as much as 27 to 30 feet just because somebody is breathing. Now, this disease is spreading, and it's also being allowed to spread. And if people are not clear about what I mean about that, after you've got now 10,000 people dead in New York City officially as a result of it, wait until you start to hear about the figures rolling in from the Indian subcontinent, the African continent, and from portions of South America, particularly Brazil, where we have, shall we say, a leader down there that who skates on the other side of the ice. I'll put it like that. He's not all there. And of course, Brazil is about 50% Black, though people in Brazil don't say it's 50% Black. So we're looking at the dream of the genocidalists. We're looking at the dream of the people who, as it used to be said 30 years ago, had the fear of a Black planet. And the next phase of what we are going to see evolve in the world is either going to take us in a direction of millions of people being exterminated essentially through this virus, or perhaps, and this is a big perhaps, we will see a reversal, see the people awaken, and see them to begin to fight back against the process that has now been unleashed.
Okay. For clarity's sake, when it said the comorbidity, you said practically every Black person, blah, 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 practically every Black person. Explain what you mean so that we're clear to the audience.
Well, I think in the last 5 years, the United States has begun to register negative life expectancies, in other words, decline in life expectancies for its entire population. You may remember, Brother Leroy, I think it was about 5 years ago, there was a sort of great alarm, about 4 years ago, actually, a great alarm because the white female population, middle class and poor, was seen to be declining in its life expectancy. And what's relevant about the figure about longevity and about the increase in life expectancy is it's one of the primary markers for a healthy economy. That is, if you have an economy where living standards have actually risen, people live longer. And so life expectancy has always been used as a fundamental marker. Well, about 4 years ago, it was demonstrated that in America, life expectancy among white females was declining. And it actually was declining at a more rapid rate than Black females. Well, why that's relevant to this discussion today is that the US economy, the actual physical economy, I'm talking now about the plant and equipment, the farms, the manufacturing of physical goods. That's your physical economy. You have a certain amount of infrastructure that goes with it, like roads, bridges, highways, tunnels, dams, is all physical. You have transportation of goods. That's part of the physical economy. The US physical economy has been in a state of negative growth. It's been going backwards since 1976 by a rate annually of approximately 2% per year. So in other words, we're now 44 years down that road. And the United States physical economy, in other words, the state of the sewers, the water pipe, the sanitation, and so on, has declined, been in a negative rate of growth by 88%. So in this whole period of time that people have thought things were going forward, they were always going backward. You just had a cell phone. You just had a laptop. You just had an iPad. And so now people are told to, quote, shelter in place at home, where they get to watch on their iPad how the next door neighbor is being carted off because they have a 12th century or 13th century disease. And so what happened is that the veneer, the cover was pulled off the United States, pulled off most of Europe, Italy particularly, Greece also. But the same thing is true in France. Same thing is true in England. And so what are you seeing? You're seeing all these people get infected, including the heads of state, like Boris Johnson. And you say, well, how is this all happening? It's happening because the physical capabilities of the United States and the transatlantic world sunk into dust. They have degenerated. They have rotted out. You're living in a hollowed out corpse. And so that is the actual truth, and that's the ugly truth. Now, when you look at Black people, the reason that we've been seeing the killings of the past 5 years in particular, I mean, we have had them for longer. You can take almost any period of time, but let's just take the last 5 to 10 years. And we know about, of course, the various shootings. But then you had the indiscriminate killing, increasingly, of Black females as well as males. This is being taught about by police forces. And therefore, the idea was all the police forces are racist, and therefore this is what's happening. Well, no, what was actually happening is that the African American population and also the Hispanic population is in the forefront of the collapse of the physical economy. For example, the MTA workers, I guess it was up to 59 that died so far in New York City, are overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic. And now, of course, the idea is, well, they're heroes because they kept driving the trains. Yeah, that was heroic. But the reason, and I think some of you who've walked around New York City know this, if you're driving around New York City, you drive around in New York City, let's say at about 9 o'clock at night, go down by Times Square, drive around, see who's out on the street. And the reason they're out on the street, besides the fact there are a lot of homeless out there, it is Black and brown people, primarily, is because they do what people call, quote, the essential jobs. So the important element, just to summarize on what I'm trying to get across, and I'll give you one simple example from South Dakota. We're going to go away from New York. We're going to South Dakota for this reason: coronavirus. So there's a case out there where 400 people at a meatpacking plant got coronavirus. It was called the Smithfield plant. So I think Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now, so they got about 3,700 employees. And what happened was 80 people were infected before anybody even knew the coronavirus was there. I have a farmer friend. His name is Ron Wazurek. And he ran for office out there in 2018, running for Congress. And he was talking to people about the state of the farms and the poverty that existed out there. Ron is white farmer, been involved for a long time with people around the Lyndon LaRouche organization. Ron told me on Monday that at that Smithfield plant, check this out, there were 54 languages spoken at the plant. 3,700 employees, but they're speaking 54 languages.
I'm sorry.
Now, the average.
Dennis, you went out. Ron was telling people about the deterioration of the farm situation. Pick it up.
I went out. Okay, you able to hear me now? Am I clear? All right. Okay. Yeah, deterioration of the farm situations. Well, so did you hear what I said about the plant with the 3,700 workers? They speak 54 languages.
Repeat that part over again.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, what's important is they have a bunch of migrant workers in South Dakota and Sioux Falls. That's what's going on. All right. And instead of, they don't just have an American workforce, because if you got 54 languages, Spanish is only one language. even if you said they were speaking Portuguese because they were from Brazil. And even if they're speaking Chinese, which of course is not a lot of Chinese probably working there, actually, what else they can be working? Some French speaking Africans, okay, let's throw them in. But how do you get 54 languages being spoken at this plant? The average wage, by the way, is about $9 an hour. So what that story tells you, and this is meat packing, so that's what you eat. So this line of Smithfield is one of the biggest meat packing companies in the world. And so what I'm trying to say here is that if you go around America, whether you're in South Dakota or the South Bronx, the condition that you're finding among working people, farmers, and unemployed, and people working below union levels, or people who are working homeless, if you start to put that together about how many people there are in America like that, it's approximately 25 to 35% of the population. This has been hidden for many, many years. And so with the reason that you cannot get hold or get a handle on how to handle the present circumstance with the virus is because the truth of the American economy is that it was a not free market economy, but a flea market economy. So it's a not a free market, but flea market. Everybody's selling something to everybody else. People are doing Uber. They call it a gig economy. What does it mean? It means you have to try to hustle, no matter if you have a college degree, because you can't make ends meet. And you have to use your car traveling across New York City roads, beating the hell out of it, right, to try to pick up money. And then you end up actually further in debt because of car repairs and tolls. So you've been in a dead end spiral way before 9/11, actually, but let's just take 9/11 as an inflection point for the past 2 decades. So the thing to understand about this coronavirus problem is that you're going to have to reconstruct the American economy around healthcare and creating a new platform in the infrastructure of the whole economy. That's what we got to do.
Okay. So the answer to my question about clarity is that Black people are in the forefront of the deterioration. That is, the deterioration is pushing us further into a negative state, and that it is not us alone. Right behind us are other people who would look at us as being, well, they're dying quicker than we are, but they're not in a safety zone themselves.
That's right. Now, what has happened? See, oligarchies are notoriously stupid. People have adopted the idea that if you are rich, you're smart. Untrue. And what you have seen now, and understand what I'm about to say, because I am not for this happening, and I hope that we are able to stop it. Because I'll tell you right now, for example, President Donald Trump is not the cause of this problem. He is not solving the problem in the way he is addressing it. Matter of fact, we have a lot of problems, of course, of conflict that's now beginning to emerge because we're now several weeks into the sudden realization of what could have been known not only in January, but could have actually been known decades ago was a condition that was going to happen. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Because here's what we're up against, and who is to blame. The financial oligarchy that bailed itself out in 2008 created this condition in America. Now, the condition existed in Africa from back in 1985. The condition existed in South America back in 1985 when we were talking about AIDS back then. And that had all come about because of the earlier 1970s policies, financial policies, and genocide policies of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. It took about 10 years for that to go around in Africa. That's what we've talked about before, Brother Leroy, as National Security Study Memorandum 200, or the Kissinger Report. People can look it up under either name. And that was done in 1974. And so at that time, they adopted a strategy to create what they called the fourth world. And that was that they redlined parts of Africa, Asia, and South America and just said, all those people are going to die. And they weren't going to give them loans. And if they gave them loans, they were going to make sure that the interest rates were so high that the country could never be developed. Countries could never be developed. That played out in the 80s, and it played out big time throughout those nations. The condition you see right now in America at the hospitals, that's what things are like in Ecuador or in Uruguay or in Ethiopia. I mean, that's just the way things go down. And so we are now in that circumstance. So this was done by the same financial interests that bailed themselves out in 2008. Comes out of the city of London primarily, and out of Wall Street secondarily. Those are the two major financial centers that are involved in this. They announced last year at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a guy by the name of Carney. I think his name is Richard Carney, I believe. I'm not clear about the first name, but he was the head of the Bank of England, the chief governor of the Bank of England. And he said, what we're going to have is financial regime change. And they were going to go after particularly Donald Trump, who they didn't like for other reasons, but that's what they announced. What you're seeing is the playing out of that right now.
Okay, it's playing out on a world stage, not
That's right.
on a national stage.
That's correct.
So the uninitiated, which I'm a part of, would say, how could they devise a scheme that would impact the entire world if they're going after a select group of individuals or a select group of the population? What am I missing?
Well, you're missing the fact that they're stupid. That's what the problem is. That in other words, it's the usual kind of thing. Remember Amos and Andy, right? They would always have these schemes, right? How they gonna make, money, right? And, it would seem to make sense initially. And then you would play out and then you find that, hey, it didn't really work. That's what you have with these people. They're just Sir Amos and Sir Andy. That's all. It's Princess Amos and Prince Andy. Okay. Literally in this case, Prince Andrew. So, I mean, look at him. I mean, remember, look at this guy, right? He's walking around with Epstein in the park. And then he said, well, I didn't know him that well. You can't say that's smart. But he was the person who was representing the Queen of England in all kinds of financial transactions of the 80s and 90s involving multiple billions of dollars, right? So that's the first thing. The other thing is that you see, to be very simply direct, racists are stupid because you see, it isn't true. So let's take what's going on right now, something being played out in America. That's to say, look at what they're trying to do with the Chinese. Trying to say now, well, the Chinese gave us the virus, and that's one line. Then the other is, well, the Chinese might not have given it to us, but they covered up at the beginning, and they should have told us more about it. Well, one could argue about that. I mean, I think every bureaucracy covers up when they come up with something that's unknown. First thing you do is you try to say, well, it's something you know. So there's that. But what's the real deal? Here's what the real deal is. Body count. New York City now has more dead people than you had in all of China. And China's 4 times the size population-wise of the United States. Which means that even if you came up with 10,000 dead people in China, that would still be equivalent to 2,500 dead in New York City. See, so the problem involved is there's tremendous embarrassment. Now check this out. They try to say, well, the Chinese didn't tell us about it. Well, the Chinese were yelling about this the whole time. They were yelling about it the whole time, and they were obviously shut down their whole economy, but they really shut it down tight. So the notion is, well, but we didn't know, and then this was used as a biological weapon that came up against us, and we had no defense for it. Well, wait a minute. The United States is spending between $1 and $2 trillion per year on defense, more than the next 26 nations combined. They surveil everybody on the planet, or at least anybody that and anything that goes in and out of the United States. They have a program through the National Security Agency called Treasure Hunt, which Mr. Bill Binney, who worked for NSA, told me all about, which allows you to track. If I'm carrying a cell phone, I don't have to use the phone or an iPad, or anything like that. I just have to have it in my iPod, any of those things. They can track everybody that has been within 10 to 12 feet of you retroactively, okay, back months. So they so they have all these capabilities, but they didn't know coronavirus was going to kill a lot of people.
Okay. Well, there's the stated sessions in September and October of 2019. Is that anything that you're aware of that you can expound upon?
Sure, I am aware of it. You're talking about the thing out of Johns Hopkins, which involved the Bill Gates and others. But of course, then there's the earlier thing that he did, which is up on YouTube from 2015. But I want to be clear. See, Dr. Osterholm has also made the point, if you listen to some of his recent interviews, and he wrote also a book about this, Deadlier Than War, I think it's called, something like that. And so people have been warning about this in various ways. So let me be very clear about what it is I'm saying, because I'm not saying, and you notice I didn't say that this thing is a bioweapon at all. And I'll tell you why I'm not saying it. Because there's a much more horrifying possibility that it's not. See, if it's not, and it's actually just spreading, and nobody, quote unquote, started it, then nobody has an antidote. Now, in that case, let me explain what would have to happen for us to survive. In that case, you pretty much have to shut down everything going on in your society and mobilize everybody to create a whole new health economic platform, which means clean water for the whole planet, because this is a pandemic. You have to have hospitals for the whole planet. You have to have various kinds of medical equipment for the whole planet. You have but to get clean water alone, there's 2 billion people that don't have clean water on the planet. And see, if they get infected and they begin to mutate the virus, you can get something that comes back. And since we don't even know that you're immune if you got it and you have antibodies. So you can be reinfected. If you're reinfected with something that's even more lethal, it's going to kill far, far more people. So you actually would then have to conclude, we actually got to turn off the war machine completely, because we can't simultaneously fund the war machine and fund what we're going to have to do in the way of health, the health mobilization, the health economic platform, which means food. You can't have something like this Smithfield plant I just told you about. You can't have that. You have to have water, as we talked about it. You have to have transportation, obviously, for the purpose of transporting food and medical supplies and so forth. You have to have trained medical personnel, and you have to have the ability to put up rapidly various forms of quarantine and other things that you got to be able to do it for people. Now you have the cultural factors, right? A lot of different countries. You got to have a lot of different countries involved in working on it, because if you don't know the culture or the language of these countries, how can you possibly get in there to help? Or for that matter, how can you even get in there just to try to prevent the further spread of the disease? The financial establishment does not want that conclusion drawn. Because if you draw that conclusion, the game is up for them, because their control was on their ability, like they just did with the bailout they just got of the $4 trillion, which is 4 times the size of the official bailout of 2008. So they recognize that if this idea of saving human life becomes primary, they're dead. And that's why that crazy congressman, I think it was from Indiana, I'm not sure, was talking today about, well, we can't make human life more important than the economy. We got to look at the hard choice. So that's where we are. That's where we are. And of course, they're talking about, they do not intend at the moment to save the lives of Black people in Africa, Black people in Brazil, or people more generally, really, as long as, they don't really seem to be within their sphere. I'll put it like that.
Okay, this is the Wisdom Table coming to you from Grand Houses Community Radio in Harlem, USA. I'm the co-host of the Wisdom Table team. Our guest online is Brother Dennis Speed of the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And we are dealing with what's going on today and interpreting what is happening right in front of us that we are not in a position to gain a definition of by ourselves. I'm going back. You use the term allowed to spread, and allowed to spread, and that's tied in, correct me if I'm wrong, that's tied into the national security document, the Kissinger document about the fourth world.
Well, let me give you this as a way of thinking about it, because you have to think about to understand what's going on right now. You have to understand what's going on all over the world to understand what's happening here, as Malcolm used to say back in Remember the Last Message. But you also have to understand a span of history that actually spans about 2,500 years. And we're not going to talk about 2,500 years, but the reason you got to know it is that it allows you to look at the things that you're going through now through the prism of the actual now, because the actual now in which you live is not limited to your particular lifespan. The actual now is characterized by your being present within the domain of some sort of society or culture. Whether you accept or reject that society or culture, you're within it. And the one we're looking at, and the demise of the thing that we're looking at, is something that goes back prior to what people think of as Greece, goes back to the Temple of Ammon in Egypt, and of the period of minimally 1200 BC, and then is better known if you study it from the period of the 7th through the 4th century, the 300-year period of approximately 700 BC before the Christian era to about 400 or 399, let's say, BC, with the death of Socrates. The reason this is relevant is because the Temple of Ammon had helped to rebuild Greece on at least 2 occasions. One about 1000 BC and a little bit earlier than that. And then the other one in the aftermath around about 700 BC. There were these great wars. There were also floods. There were other things that happened. And the center of knowledge, which came out of Egypt, was the one that Plato, for example, and Socrates differently were educated by, Pythagoras earlier than that, and so on. I'm mentioning this because you have to know that to know why, when you look at today here, you could look at many anniversaries, but you want to think about how to at least look at this as a 100-year cycle. You hear people talking about the 1918 Spanish flu.
Right, right.
All right, well, they're talking about that because that was at the end of the First World War. And 50 to 100 million people, depending on who you believe, or your figures, died. So some people are saying this is a centuries, this sort of a centennial event that we're living in. Could be, but let me give you an idea of something that happened back in 1981. This is a statement from an investment director for what was called the U.S. Trust Company back then. So this is the beginning of the 1980s, right? So this means the 60s are over, the civil rights, Black Power era is over, the 70s are over, the end of the war in Vietnam, disco and all that, right? And the beginning of hip hop. And now we're at 1981. And this is what is said by a guy named James Groome, Groome. He says, we have decided to shift the economy out of the unprofitable old sectors, such as steel and auto, into new high productivity industries such as computers and microchips. And that's where we're shifting our investments. The sunset stocks are being dumped for good. Now, sunset stocks means industry, like all the stuff that people used to go into to become skilled, whether it was skilled mechanic, machinist, whatever it might be, right? That's how Black people in particular and other poor people entered the workforce and became skilled. So he says the sunset stocks are being dumped for good. We are shifting altogether out of the long-term bond investment in the older industries and into stocks of the new industries. This shift has forced U.S. Steel, for example, to close many of their plants. They will now have to close many more because there will be no large investors to buy their bonds. Chrysler will be broken up and its pieces will be sold off. The workforce will have to move south. Now, that didn't mean the southern United States, is what people thought it meant. It actually meant Mexico. Okay. And then eventually to places like China. Now, 4 years after that statement I just read you, Executive Intelligence Review released a thing called Economic Breakdown and the Threat of Global Pandemics. I repeat that title. It's a July 1st, 1985 report we put out called Economic Breakdown and the Threat of Global Pandemics. All right. Now, what was this report about? What was it saying? Okay. Check this out. Page 2 of that report. We forecast at that time that a global ecological holocaust would be the inevitable consequence of the policies then being implemented by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to slash the food and energy consumption of the world's population. At the same time that the already insufficient basic medical and health infrastructure of the globe was drastically curtailed for so-called budgetary and financial reasons. The IMF and World Bank specified the triaging of certain nations and entire regions, which were given the designation the Fourth World. They were written off as unworthy of any investment for economic development. They were called bad credit risks. And these Fourth World nations were established instead as looting zones. At Lyndon LaRouche's suggestion, a task force investigated what the consequences would be if the International Monetary Fund and World Bank applied this to the world as a whole. And so what we came up with at the time is that you were going to get the deaths of billions of 1 to 2 billion people. That's what you're referring to, Brother Leroy, when you talk about the Kissinger report or the National Security Study Memorandum 200. Which was implication of world population growth for U.S. security overseas interests, U.S. security and overseas interests.
Where does NAFTA fall into this picture?
NAFTA was the next phase. What NAFTA was you heard me talk about this thing about the sunset industries were going to go. So now you had to have NAFTA because all the industry was going to go to Mexico. And then they were going to do this cute trick with Canada, where remember, almost the entire 85% of the entire Canadian population lives within 200 miles of the US border. In other words, you just go up to 200 miles north and you've just covered basically 85% of everybody that lives in Canada.
Right.
So what NAFTA was about was what people now call globalization. And of course, that's what the virus itself is. That's globalization too. And what you did was you created, you did away with redundancy in the American economy. In other words, you had no stocks, no reserves, like you saw with the thing with the ventilators. You have a just-in-time economy. So now you don't have any actual, and then you also did the same thing with the skills of your labor force. You basically, and we know, of course, that was the purpose of spreading the crack cocaine and the other things into the Black community, because that workforce, which was the last major workforce in the urban industrial centers. Because remember, all the cities, this gets forgotten these days, were industrial. Pittsburgh was industrial. Akron, Ohio was industrial. Detroit was industrial. Chicago had the big stockyards and various other kinds of industry. New York City had 1 million industrial workers, people working at small factories and plants and so on all over the place, as well as, of course, being attached to the transportation system and sanitation and all those kinds of functions. So that's what happened. Now, why am I telling people about that? Because what you see now with this virus here is what people saw in Africa, saw in South America, and saw in different parts of Asia back in 1985. And then later on again, it occurred, of course, the SARS cases, the Ebola epidemic, of course, which we saw down in Sierra Leone and other parts, and also in parts of Congo and so forth. So that's the biological weapon. Biological weapon is the City of London's financial policies and the International Monetary Fund and World Bank's implementation of a financial policy. That's how the thing went down.
Dennis, explain, and Dick Gregory broke it down to me, and I didn't understand what he was saying. I had to ask him twice. So, the City of London, explain to us what that is. That is not London; it's the City of London.
Okay, yeah. This is for everybody that's ever been interested in the question of the Masonic side of the conspiracy. That's where you look. Here's what it is. It's a district within. Okay, if you were to visit, you got off a plane, now you're in London, right? And you say to people, well, I'd like to know what the City of London is. First, they're going to just look at you. But then they're going to realize you actually know what you're not supposed to know. So they might figure maybe you would give an access. What you do is you go down. It's in the center of London. It's off center of London, but it has its own mayor. It has its own legal department. It has its own set of guilds. They call them guilds, and they're sort of Masonic lodges as well. And what they are is this financial district. It's like if you got off a plane in New York City and said, "I want to go to the financial district," and then somebody say, "Oh, you mean Wall Street, right?" And then, of course, everybody in New York would assume you knew what Wall Street was. Well, it's the same thing about City of London. So City of London sounds difficult to an American, but to anybody in London, they understand what it means immediately. Now, what this is the center of the power that destroyed China with the Opium War. It's the center of power that also ran the drug traffic post 1945 and into the period, particularly the 50s, 60s, into New York City and the other locations. It's the Hong Kong, it's what you call HSBC Bank was the center of this. HSBC stands for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. This is the corporation that ran the Opium Wars. And what they did with respect to heroin, particularly after it became illegal, for a long time, certain of these drugs, opium running and so on, was legal till about 1912, between 1912 and 1916. What they did was they developed a very regulated heroin market, running it largely out of Hong Kong, which was more regulated than oil, actually, for a long time. But then diversified this. And so what happened was it was diversified to create an offshore banking capability, which was started in the 1960s. That's what they used. All of the various, Rolling Stones and the Beatles and all, they were used for that. It wasn't that they were in on it. They were used to promote it. This came into the ghettos big time. Of course, the heroin was there earlier from the 40s, well, even the 20s, of course, and all that. But then when it became epidemic with the panic in Needle Park in 1970 and that kind of thing, that was being done to subjugate, to pacify, to put down the rebelliousness that was in the populations coming particularly off the assassination of King, And then it blew up, of course, during the Thanksgiving holiday of 1985 and the crack cocaine, quote, epidemic. And so what this was about was it was a monetary, it was an access, it was a creating a pool of liquidity, cash, which cash would then be leveraged into real estate, which real estate was then leveraged into what became known a little bit later as mortgage-backed securities, which securities were then leveraged into what was called credit default swaps, which was a way of insuring the mortgage-backed securities, which were then leveraged into other forms of derivatives trade, which involved all kinds of names, collateralized debt obligations, da da da. What they were doing was they were leveraging the original cash coming from this, but this was looting the population physically. It was debilitating the health of the communities. It was creating all sorts of deserts in the middle of the cities. And if you look at American cities, there's not a single one of them that you would say you could reliably allow a 6-person family, a mother, father with 4 kids, and he or she has one job that maintains that family. You could say that in 1960, but you can't say it in 2020. And it is the city of London that created that system. Wall Street benefited from it also. It blew up, it ballooned in the 80s during globalization and NAFTA. And then it took over in the 1990s with the so-called derivatives bubble. They bailed themselves out in 2007, 2008. And as a result of that, they immiserated, they looted the physical backs of their own populations. And that's exactly why right now, everybody in America has now who works is about to get a welfare check so that the banks can steal another $4 trillion plus dollars, which they will put on your back as well.
Okay, this is the wisdom table, and quite often we have to dig past the statement. I just want to say this, that when you mention the Rolling Stones and the other rock groups being used to glamorize and legitimize, those in quotes, the particular drugs, there's a book for folks who got lost on that because it's, it's a quote unbelievable. There's a book, I think the guy's name is Potash. I don't have it right in front of me, but there's a book on that. Equally, there is documentation that the heroin trade was introduced to the Black community by way of the jazz club. That was Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio. I'm just adding to what you had to say. That the fact that these things that have resulted in what we think are natural swings of the market have been engineered, like NAFTA. And I have to give credit to, oh man, the brother, he was way ahead of the game, social scientist, and his name is not coming to me right now, but he wrote the book on black economic power. Oh man, great brother. Well, anyway, he saw in advance what NAFTA would mean to the Black community. And because he wasn't talking Black history, I wasn't interested in those sessions. But today, the NAFTA and what it did to the Black community, the fact that there are no jobs is not an accident. That's the point that you're making with the sunset. The guy that makes it's not an accident. It's design. It's created. The situation is created, and then the drug coming into the community creates a situation where we see ourselves as perpetrators of the reason for the demise of the community, but the stuff has been structured. It's been designed by a group and implemented under the cover of acts and drug trade, etc. Is that correct?
Yeah, just so people, if they're interested in the little thing we reference, I mean, there's so many different ways to document it. It's easy to document. It's a book called Acid Dreams. Acid Dreams was originally released as Acid Dreams, The Complete Social History of LSD, the CIA, the 60s and beyond. The title was slightly different in the later edition. But the idea, to just understand this stuff, is that the drug traffic was run by the city of London, and it was run from the 1849. It was run first on China. And that's why, the Chinese were very aware of this. That's why you won't find this kind of drug problem, despite the wealth of China and so forth. You won't find that in China now. You won't find that now because they know what it did to them then. And see, look, fundamentally, let's just put it like I said it before. I don't want to be too wrongly provocative, but like, look at it. Yellow people have the most productive, strongest economy in the world now. White people do not. Now, that is not necessarily the way I see it. I wouldn't put it that way, but it is the way that, shall we say, certain of the military forces, financial forces, and certainly so-called oligarchical families, that's exactly what they see. Faced with that as a reality, they would rather blow the whole world up and will attempt to do so. So I want people to understand that. Faced with that reality, they will blow the whole world up. So we are looking at that. So when you start hearing people talking about, China, they created this virus. Well, wait a minute. See, if you're really saying they made a weapon against your country and they're killing hundreds of thousands of your people, that's a cause for war, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So people have to understand where this is, because there is a notion. Anybody that understands deeply has actually studied eugenics, has actually studied the history of actual racism. We're not talking about little Klansmen running around and, that's bad. But I'm talking about the people who are the theoretical racists, the Bertrand Russells of the world, who doesn't get acknowledged that way, but that, or people like Frederick Lewis Osborne from America here, the people around the Museum of Natural History that had the Congolese Oda Benga, put him in the zoo. Those people, the people that think that way, who are the so-called great families of the West, those people, you confront them with the idea that non-white people are in the ascendancy on their watch and they got nuclear weapons.
Okay, now, coincidence. Is Smithfield American owned?
No, it's actually owned by a company called WH out of Hong Kong. Now, here's the interesting question. Does that mean it's Chinese? See, if it's Hong Kong, it can be British or Chinese or both. So that's something else to understand. See, this is the world we're in. Remember, because the British ran Hong Kong for 99 years. They just were caused to have to give it up back in, I think it was 98, something like that. 98, yeah.
Smithfield, according to what I read, just a blurb, Smithfield, the production there is pigs, and that was for export, not for internal use or consumption in America. But anyway, it's just an interesting quote.
But here's what's going on. You realize that more of America's food is being imported now than exported. So what's going on is it's then part of the NAFTA game. wherever you are, the food is being produced to be exported to some other location. Why? And that is happening all over the world. It's true in Africa. That's true in Haiti right now. Haiti, right, has to import rice, which it can grow in abundance.
I've had some hills to climb. I've had some weary days. And so many lonely sleepless nights. But when I look around, I start thinking things over. All of my good days.
Okay, hopefully we're back. And Dennis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, let's go to the chat room. If there are any questions in the chat room, Doug, do we have anything there? Any questions? And this is the wisdom table coming in from Grand Houses in Harlem, USA, independent station. And for those individuals who are tuned in, there are other interviews that we've done over the course of the last 3-4 weeks dealing with the health aspect of COVID-19. You should go to Grand Houses, Wisdom Table.
The question, Lord.
Brother Leroy, this is
That's it.
Doug. We're gonna have to wrap up here and make way for the next show.
The next
Is it possible to get Dennis to come back for part 2 of this?
Sure.
Okay, Dennis, you'll let us, oh, I'm sorry, Dennis, there's an event that you have coming up.
Yes, that'll be April 25th. People